pass you over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Dave. Here's the share screen, I hope. Where's it gone? There it is. Okay, I'm hoping we can all see that. Is that visible to you, Dave?
It is indeed. It is
Good.
indeed. Yeah.
Right. Just so that if you're watching this back on the YouTube and you want to go to a particular section to check on the features of a particular butterfly, that's the order in which I'm going through them. And I always say this, but I'm going to say it because it's so important, and it's so often the thing that is most important if you only get a short glimpse of a butterfly. For instance, when it flies past, or if it settles briefly and as you walk towards it goes away again, look at the detail at the wing edges. For almost all species, that's the important bit. And the wing shape can be helpful. I know this sounds bonkers, but in a way the color is less useful to you, partly because you immediately notice the color, but what you should be focusing on is the wing edge detail. A reminder that looking at the butterfly's size isn't awfully helpful, really. I mean, it can be really useful, but butterflies do have changes in size according to their diet. So they can be bigger if they've been feeding on food plants that were nice and healthy, and smaller if they've had a rather restricted diet for some reason. And maybe this year there are going to be quite a few small things because the drought will have made the food plant rather less palatable, I think. But their actions are very helpful because if they're chasing other butterflies, they're males. And if they seem to be skulking about, trying not to fly around too much, and they're continually landing on plants and tapping their feet and antenna on those plants, then they're females looking to lay eggs. And that's helpful to you because you sometimes need to know if it's a male or a female to help you with the identification. Okay, I'll go through this really quickly, but I think there are basically two types of nymphallid butterfly. There's the orangey ones, which you can see listed on the left, and the darker ones, which can look almost black when they fly past. I don't mean, as I've put, I don't mean when it's a silhouette against the sky. I mean, even when you've got reasonably good light on them, those on the right-hand side can look so dark it's hard to tell them apart. But we'll come to that in a minute. So I'm imagining that everyone knows the peacock is the butterfly with those glorious eye spots on four wings. And normally you'll be able to see that it has four eye spots. We did when we were out on one of our surveys recently find a peacock which was very odd because the forewing and hind wing had somehow got glued together, so it appeared to have no hind wing eye spot on one side, but it was just a matter of the wings being a bit glued together by something. So normally you can see the four eye spots. They're really obvious, and the peacock therefore is quite easy. And there should be lots around soon because there's lots of caterpillars about. A bit more difficult are the other, in my opinion, orange nymphalids. You've got the comma, the painted lady, and the small tortoiseshell. And the things which I think are pretty obvious are the ragged outline of the comma, the blue lunules, as they're called, these little blue chevrons or triangles around the outside of the tortoiseshell, and the fact that the painted lady has a sort of triangular point to the wing, which is black and white. The others don't, do they? Both the comma and the tortoiseshell have this sort of stripe across here, and the tortoiseshell, there is a definite difference between the color between the black blocks and the ground color of the rest of the wing. Whereas in the comma, that difference between the color between the blocks and the rest of the wing is much less obvious. So comma, ragged outline, tortoiseshell, less ragged outline, blue lunules, painted lady, more pointed, and black and white tips. The undersides are more similar. The comma, once again, look, we're looking at this wavy outline, and that really is a big, big help. The tortoiseshell, you can usually see if it's a fresh tortoiseshell, the blue lunules showing through. And if that isn't enough because the butterfly has become worn and so it isn't really clear, just look at the fact that there is a relatively well scalloped edge here and quite a contrast between the dark inner part nearest the body and the paler outer part to the wing. Because when we look at the peacock, with which you could easily get it mixed up, the confusion there, the peacock, there is far less difference between the outer edge of the wing and the inner, and also it's a far straighter junction. Much less sign of this sort of scallops you've got in the tortoiseshell. Usually, if you see them sitting with their wings closed like this, they sit still for a while, so you'll get a good chance to look at them and work out which of those three it is. And I've put the speckled wood here as well because just conceivably, if you see one in a fairly dark, shady spot, you might initially think, oh, that looks a bit like a peacock or a tortoiseshell. It hasn't got the wavy outline of the comma, has it? But if you get a chance to look at it closely enough, you'll immediately see all these little eye spots on the hind wing, which obviously it can't be any of the others. They don't have any eye spots at all. And if you see it with a light on it, as this one was, you'll notice it's got a sort of pleated edge to the wing. Red Admiral and Painted Lady. Very quickly sticking this in because both of them have the same pointy wingtip with black and white. A family similarity there. And underneath, when you see the underside, both beautiful, very similar actually. If you look at the patterns, they are very similar because I said there were no eye spots on the other nymphalids that we've looked at so far, but here you can see there are eye spots. But that black and white pointy tip to the wing isn't exactly black and white here, but there is still those white spots in the triangular top or tip of the wing, quite obvious. The reason the Red Admiral is much darker is that it's a butterfly more often seen in the northern parts of Europe, where it can sit on surfaces and be better camouflaged by being very dark. The Painted Lady, remember, is a migrant that comes up from the sub-Sahara, Sahara, and regions like the Atlas Mountains, where they live in very dry, sandy conditions. So it's better for them to look much sandier coloured. And they are very well camouflaged if ever you see them sitting on sandy ground or even on artificial surfaces like flagstones and so on. Okay, moving on. Yep, just pointing out they share that tip. So we're going to move quickly to the fritillaries. Both of these are flying at the minute, easily confused, but I think it's really helpful that the silver washed alliterates as the stripy woodland, and the stripy woodland definitely, you can definitely see if you're remembering to look at wing edges, if this flies past and settles, you can see that it's got a much more pointy wing section. The dark green on the other side, or dotty grassland, if you see this, I'm afraid it's much less likely to come to a stop anywhere near you because it flies really fast and tends to keep going for a long time. So it's not as helpful as the silver wash, which tends to go shorter distances before it stops. And the silver wash is much more likely to settle on flowers in woodland, for instance, brambles. The dark green whizzes about all over the place and doesn't stop anything like as much, but it does go to knapweed fairly frequently and sometimes scabious. Anyway, it's got a more rounded outline, but the best way to tell these two apart if they settle, and you can see the underside, is that the dark green has this silver wash, hence the name, where it looks a bit like if you can imagine a beach when the tide is going out and there's a low sun, the way you get that ripple effect. But the dark green dotty grassland is covered in these silvery white dots. So the underside hind wing, really different. And the best way to tell them apart if they settle and show the hind wing, but even in flight, if they come close enough and they're flying slowly enough, you can see how much more pointed the wingtip of the silver washed is. Now, I've put this in, and I'm assuming everyone remembers what this species is. Do you remember what I was saying about a feature of the underside of this species which helps you to distinguish it? Of course you do. There we go. It's that pointy wingtip with the white spots in it. You haven't got anything like that on the fritillaries. The painted lady with this white pointy tip shouldn't be confused, because although you might see these pale spots here and think, oh, it could be dark green fritillary, no, because of the tip of the forewing. Okay, the upper sides of these fritillaries, the silver washed at the top and the dark green at the bottom, are more difficult to tell apart. And that's the same actually with many of the fritillaries. The upper sides are not as helpful as the undersides, but we don't have to worry about most of them in our area because sadly we've lost them. Anyway, I think you'll be able to see that because we look at wing edges, we notice the wing edge of the silver washed is pretty much the same color orange all the way around hind wing and forewing, right the way across the wing. Whereas if we look at the dark green, there is a difference, isn't there? It is much paler right at the edge. I think the rounded shape is even more obvious in these pictures because the butterflies are posing perfectly to show how the rounded wing of the dark green is a real contrast to the pointy, slender wing of the silver wash. The silver wash is actually a bigger butterfly. I think these pictures don't show that very well. The dark green is actually slightly smaller than the silver washed usually. But I think you can see that the rounded dotty grassland fritillary, or dark green, is paler at the edge, and this is most marked in the females. If you see a male silver washed, you'll also notice that in addition to being pointy and orange all the way, it's got very dark black veins, and the male dark green doesn't have that to anything like the same extent. So just a reminder, painted lady, black and white wing tip, which helps you differentiate it from the fritillaries. Okay, before I start talking about the browns, do we have any questions about any of the nymphalids? It would appear not.
Don't think so, Nick.
Okay, so in the spring up until now, it was fairly easy to know which browns you were looking at because of the browns, we only had specklewood and small heath, but now, of course, we've got meadow brown and ringlet, which can be tricky to tell apart, and the marbled white, which isn't a problem, except that it's very numerous and very attractive, so it tends to distract us rather. The small heath is still flying. In fact, it's just started a new brood, but the size of it normally allows us to tell what it is fairly easily. Let's look at speckled wood very briefly. You should be able to tell speckled wood from ringlet quite easily because the speckled wood is the only butterfly that you're going to see in the UK or in our part of the UK with these creamy spots which have no black pupil. So plenty of creamy spots all over the place, and quite a lot of them have no black pupil. So other species may well have lots of creamy spots, but they also have black pupils. And I mentioned before, didn't I, this pleated effect because of the way the veins and the wing between them, the veins stand out and the wing seems to be folded back between them. The ringlet, like I said, plenty of spots, but they're all black pupilled, and the only spot on this male meadow brown is also black pupilled. Well, perhaps you could argue white pupilled with a black iris, but anyway, the point is you don't get creamy spots that are open without any black, like in the speckled wood I've put in there just to show what I'm talking about. Now, I think the thing that helps you identify a ringlet from a meadow brown most easily, if you see a ringlet which is lovely and fresh, is the contrast. You can see this when it flies past. The contrast of that white edge, this margin, is really white compared with the dark chocolate brown of the butterfly. The meadow brown never shows such a strong contrast. You will sometimes see a meadow brown that has a sort of pale hind wing, and that's a bit confusing because they're not supposed to, in theory. The textbooks usually show them looking like my photo, but there are a percentage of meadow browns that have a much paler hind wing, so it can be nearly as pale as the margins are. But don't be confused by that. Meadow browns, most of it is a sort of a warm milk chocolate brown, and the margins are a sort of dingy brown color too, aren't they? They're not as clean and white as the ringlet. So if the butterfly flies past and you're lucky and the ringlet you're looking at is quite fresh, you should be able to see the contrast. I'm afraid it's got to be said, there are going to be times when you're going to see a brown butterfly fly past and you will work out, well, it's either a ringlet or a meadow brown, but if it's been flying around for a week or so already, it might be nearly impossible to tell them unless they settle. So I do advocate, as people know, using a net. If you're doing a survey and you need to know what you've seen, whether you saw more ringlets than meadow browns or more meadow browns and ringlets, a net is helpful because they can be very similar when they're worn. But just to come back to it, ringlet, plenty of spots, but they do not have any, ringlet do not have any spots which are creamy without a black iris, white pupil, or black pupil. Meadow brown, a single eye spot, single white pupil, and some orange colour on the wing, which when it settles should be obvious. Sometimes it is in flight, but it isn't always. Meadow brown has quite a distinct difference between the male and the female being much paler and more orange, and she is usually a bit bigger. But there is always, no, not always, there is 90% of the time a single black pupil. Just to confuse us, occasionally a female meadow brown might have two white pupils in each black eye spot, but that's rare. You don't see it often. Maybe you'll see 3 or 4 this summer compared with hundreds of normal ones, but you do occasionally get them. The ringlet, just to mention, male and female ringlet, they look near identical. You can't really tell them apart. Not an easy glance. You could look at the shape and size of the abdomen, because the female always, in every species, has a slightly thicker abdomen. Usually it appears shorter because it's thicker. Okay, undersides, meadow brown, single black eye spot with a single white pupil. Ringlet, lots of eyes, spots all over it, but they've all got black centers and white pupils in there. And then the speckled wood, quite a lot of eye spots, but look, these don't have any black. So some of the eye spots do, some of the creamy patches have no spot. And the small heath, the other butterfly, I haven't spent a lot of time on it now, it looks very much like a small meadow brown, but those of you who came out in the spring and saw them will remember how clearly this little, almost a triangle, of pale colour just there stands out in the field. The meadow brown also has a pale stripe, you might say, right across the wing. And the small heath only has it halfway. So it sort of helps to remember it's small, so it's only got half that hind wing stripe. But that stands out brilliantly in the field. It doesn't show quite so well in photos for some reason, I'm not sure why. But a small heath, you will always be able to see half a pale stripe there. On the meadow brown, you can see a complete pale stripe. No stripe of that similar sort on the ringlet. You could argue there is a sort of a stripe here, but with the speckled wood, we might notice the pleating, and we will notice cream spots without any black centers. I've got the small copper here. I'll just deal with it quickly because sometimes people get a little bit mixed up between the small heath and the small copper. So it's not one of the browns. It's actually one of the blue family of butterflies. But as you can see, it looks quite a bit like a small heath here. But because you were listening intently, both now and of course when you were out with me in the spring, if you were, you'll remember that if this was a small heath, there'd be that pale patch, almost triangular patch, just here like a half streak of very pale colour, which is never visible on a small copper. If the small copper opens its wings, immediately you know it isn't a small heath because they never open their wings when they settle. But in addition, you can see all these black speckles in the beautiful coppery orange colour. It is strange, I think, that you will probably notice if you look at this picture now I'm mentioning it. The hind wing on the upper side is black and then orange, and the hind wing on the underside is paler than the orange margin. So that's slightly odd, isn't it? That the very dark colour on the upper side doesn't translate, doesn't give you a darker hind wing underside. It's paler. Not quite sure what advantage that is to the small copper, but that's the way it is. And there's the small heath. There's that half a stripe, not quite so triangular in this particular specimen, but you can see, I hope, that the small heath and the small copper should be easily told apart. For once, not the wing edge, but this white mark, often looking a little bit like a triangle, but usually half a stripe on the hind wing. So let's see if there's any questions about the browns that we've just looked at. And before anyone asks, if you're about to say, what about the gatekeeper, Nick? I left that because I know you are likely to see gatekeeper soon, but I'm going to deal with the gatekeeper in the next talk.
So we've got a couple of questions, Nick.
Okay, good.
One from Colin.
Yep.
Is there a difference in flight patterns between ringlet and meadow brown?
Well, some people would say that there is, and I think perhaps yes, there is. I think the ringlet is perhaps a bit more bouncy, and in my experience, the ringlet tends to fly in shadier spots. So if you see a butterfly that's flying in quite a bouncy way and it's deliberately choosing to fly in the shade, then it's more likely to be a ringlet. I've known people tell me they don't think ringlets fly as far as meadow browns. So if it doesn't go very far, maybe that's a clue.
Right.
My experience on the distance that they fly is that it's very variable. But meadow browns often do seem to have a slightly more direct flight, but it's a minimal difference. It's really hard to tell.
Well, we've had another question from Sarah, which was what we were discussing before about what's the best time of day to spot butterflies. And given that it's getting hot over the next coming days,
Yeah,
is that a good time? And that's
no,
exactly what we were just discussing, wasn't it?
yes. And you will notice if you've been looking at your survey rules and regulations, guidelines, I think they're actually called, that you're allowed to go out earlier in the morning on hot days. So you can start, I think it's 10:45 for transects. It might be 10:30 for the wider countryside butterfly survey, but definitely if it's 20 degrees centigrade by 10:30, then I don't think there's any reason to hang about, especially if the sun's shining, because in the middle of the day, the butterflies will be seeking shade. They'll be much less likely to move around. Some species, the skippers, don't seem to care really. They buzz about, whether it's really, really hot or just hot. But the meadow brown, the ringlet, the speckled wood, possibly the marbled white, probably not quite so affected. But the browns are species that definitely seek the shade. And I think it's also true of the nymphalids. They're a bit more active when it's cooler. They tend to pop into the shade if it's a bit too hot. And by too hot, I think anything over 28, you could assume that you'll see slightly fewer butterflies because they go to the shade. So some people favor walking earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon stroke evening. But remember, your survey times for both transects and wider countryside mean that you can't really be looking and counting after 4 o'clock. the latest you ought to be out is around about 3 to perhaps 3:30. So although many people will tell you, and it's quite right, you can often see butterflies quite late in the evening on hot days, I think best thing is to try and get out in the morning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick.
Let's move on. We did some more copper. Marbled white was the other brown. I don't really think we need to say very much about this apart from, isn't it glorious? And just in case you're a complete newcomer, the thing to spot that tells you it's definitely a marbled white and not a green veined white is that with the marbled white, the dark color goes across the wing, top to bottom, across the wing. But with the green vein white, the dark color goes from the body to the wing edge. So it goes across the wing at 90 degrees. I hope you can see what I'm trying to say there. I'm not saying it very well, it's rather clumsily explained. But from the body to the wing edge in the green veined white, and across the body from one top to bottom, as opposed to out to the wing edge, on both the fore and the hind wing in the marbled white. The marbled white's slightly bigger than the green vein white as well, but I can certainly understand that at a distance they might look similar. I think the marbled white, as soon as it stops, there's really nothing else to compare it with in this country. Okay, now, here we go. Ground colour is no help with the whites. The whites are really troublesome. I put the marbled white in just before the do whites to get that one out the way in case people think the marbled white is a white butterfly, because I know it's called marbled white, but it's actually a brown. The white butterflies have far less of anything apart from white in their wings, and that makes it difficult to tell them apart. They fly a lot. I mean, one of the things about the whites is that they have food plants for their caterpillars, which are widely spread and rather thinly spread as well. So they do a lot of flying around looking for each other to mate and for their food plant. The size of the butterfly is some help, because the smaller ones like the wood white and the orange tip, I don't think anyone's going to see an orange tip from now. It's too warm, but you might. So the wood white and the orange tips are the smallest, followed by the green vein white and the small white. The brimstone and the large white are normally, I say normally, larger. You can get small brimstones and you can get small large whites. But generally speaking, green vein white and small white are about the same size and smaller than the similar size brimstone and large white. The thing to look at, not surprisingly, I say it over and over, when you see a white butterfly, don't look to see if it's white, look to see what the wing edges are like. If the wing edges are pointed and the ground color is either yellow or white, it's a brimstone. It's the pointy shape that tells you it's a brimstone. I mean, obviously with the male, the color helps immensely, but the yellow color could be confused with a clouded yellow, but you'll notice it hasn't got anything like the same pointiness to the wings. And it does have, if you see it with its wings open enough to see them clearly, a black spot here on the forewing and a white center to the brown spot on the hind wing. So the two spots on the wing are strangely similarly positioned to the spots on the brimstone, but they are different. But it's the wing shape that's the most useful. Small white and large white. Now, here, very helpfully, the small white has a small amount of black at the wing tip, and the large white has a large amount, and in addition, it's almost in the shape of an L. This L is on its side just to confuse us, but there's an L shape, isn't there? Across the top and a similar distance down the side. The green vein white, which I've now stuck here on top of the small, has a smaller than the large white, a smaller amount of black on the tip here, but it comes down even further than it comes down on the large white, with obvious triangular black vein edges. So where the veins meet the edge of the wing, you get a black triangle coming in. And it isn't so obviously an L shape, is it? But those black triangles are always present on any green veined white. You can always find them. Sometimes you need to net the butterfly to get a good look at it, because if it isn't going to sit still, that's hard to see. But the size of the small white and green vein white tend to separate them out from the large white. And the amount of black should be a really good clue. The large white is really obviously black tips. You can see this in flight. Okay. Now, what I did in those last pictures was mix up male and female pictures. So if we just go back a minute, those of you who've listened to me before will know this, but those who hadn't thought about it, can you see that here we have a single cell spot, as it's called, whereas here we have a cell spot and an extra black spot below it? That isn't a difference between the small white and the large white. That's a difference between a male white butterfly and a female white butterfly. So the wing tip marking tells you which species, and the number of spots tells you which sex. So if we go to this pair of pictures, these are both small white. We know they're small white because of the small amount of black at the tip. Doesn't come to halfway down the wing like it does in the large and the green veined. And we know this one's a female because she's got the black cell spot, as the male has, but she's got additional black markings. This one, it isn't a single spot, is it? It's sort of several smaller black smudges, but this is the same large white, green vein white, and small white. All of them share the male with a single spot and the female with more than one spot. Looking very quickly at a female brimstone, notice the pointy edge, which is what you would expect because that's what we were told a little while ago. Pointy edge makes it a brimstone, whatever color it is. And it's possible that you could see a female brimstone fly past you and think it's a white butterfly and not a brimstone, because they can be incredibly pale. But you should be able to tell them apart from any other butterfly when they settle because of the wing shape. And the female green vine white, I'm just putting it here to show you that it does have these extra spots, like the small and the large. Okay. A little bit of extra, if you need it, when you see them with their wings closed, not much black showing through at the wing tip on a small white, as you'd expect. Bit more black showing through at the wing tip on a green vein white, as you'd expect, but also the grey along the veins that go from the body towards the edge. And the large white, a lot more black, really obvious through the wingtip, right the way down here. And as I've mentioned with the arrows, the amount of black scales on the wing is helpful too. The small white has far fewer of these black scales, and they tend to be below this central line here, the main vein that goes through the middle of the wing. So above it is much yellower, and below it is much grayer. Whereas with the large white, these black scales are scattered about on the hind wing pretty much evenly, both sides of this central vein. You don't normally need to know that, but if you see a small white, large white, which is completely closed up, roosting for the night, for instance, then that will be really helpful, because you'll be able to look. Oh, look, for instance, this butterfly has got lots of black scales scattered all over the hind wing, evenly above and below the central vein, so it's a large white. But normally when you see them, you get to see the tips. And as we've already said, small white, tip, very small amount of black, large white tip, very large amount of black. I'm just quickly going to mention the wood white. I think the first brood of wood white is probably done, and we don't get any in the Chilterns. You have to go up to the Bucks Northants border. And I know that people do go up there, so I thought I'd include it because people like to see this butterfly, so they make a trip up there specially. They perhaps hope to combine it with spotting a checkered skipper. Anyway, the wood white, we talked about the wing shape of the brimstone being very pointy. This one is a very rounded butterfly, and that rounded shape is obvious in flight. But the thing that stands out above all else, if you see a wood white fly past you, is that it looks like it's almost a sort of bit of tissue paper that's blowing in the wind. It's so floppy and fluttery, gives the impression that it isn't really under control of where it goes. In fact, wood whites can fly a long way, but they have the most amazingly fluttery, apparently disjointed flight. It must be that they are actually under good control and they can make themselves go in the right direction because they find their food plant and they find flowers to nectar on and so on, but they don't look as if they do. And then one last helpful thing, you've got this wing tip which has got a circular blob, quite different from the others, and grey smudging that goes a bit like marbled white, isn't it? It's not along the veins, it's across the wing. But you wouldn't confuse this with a marbled white because it looks so pale and fluttery. Just in case you're going to get all excited about a green vein white where the veins are very pale, which can happen. The wing shape is a good clue, but also there's always the tip being grey here in a sort of a line, a smudge, rather than this rounded spot on the wood white. And the wood white, by the way, doesn't have a cell spot. So there's no black cell spot either on the wood white. Okay, the whites are a tricky group. I think there might be questions. Let's see.
There's one. I like. I'm not sure either. It's for Lavinia. Are the brimstone and the clouded yellow a similar size?
Yes.
Yeah.
However, the brimstone looks slightly bigger because it's a brighter yellow. And I don't know
Interesting.
if people have noticed this, but things which are a bright color tend to look slightly bigger than dark colors, don't they? Even if they're the same size. So they are a similar size. I think the brimstone is probably very slightly bigger in reality, and it looks bigger than it is because it's a bright color.
Thank you very
No
much.
more questions about the whites? Well, that's good. Perhaps people have just given up in disgust on the grounds that they're far too difficult.
I think they have, yeah. The seagull
Yes.
problem, yeah.
Again, I'm going to say, please, if you're struggling to identify whites when they fly past, do not beat yourself up and think, I need to give up. I'm hopeless at this. You are exactly the same as everybody else. Nobody can accurately identify a white that flies past on the very edge of their survey, the imaginary box, the 5 meter square. It's just not possible. If it's a large white and you can see the black tips, fine. But small white, female orange tip, I don't think we'll see any of those again. And the green vein white, they're just not possible to be told apart. The only answer is to catch them or hope that they settle very close by and you can get your binoculars on before they move on again. They don't, often when they settle, they don't stay there very long, do they? That's another nuisance thing about the whites, but you will under-record whites. Everybody does. It's perfectly normal. And it doesn't mean you're a failure. It means you're a human and that these things are blooming annoying. Okay, blues. Now, I have tried to say something about their size. I don't know that this is very helpful because apart from the small blue and sometimes the brown argus, most of them appear to be pretty much the same size actually. But for what it's worth, the small blue and the brown argus are definitely smaller than the others. The small blue is smaller than the brown argus, but you can get brown argus so tiny that they look to be the same size as a small blue. The Chalk-Hill blue and the Adonis are the biggest, but again, they're not that much bigger than the common blue and holly blue or the purple hairstreak. So you need to look for other things really than the size. You might tell if they fly past you something about what they are from the sort of the hue I've described it here. saturation of blue. I'm not quite sure what to call it. But if it's an incredibly brilliant blue, then think to yourself it might be Adonis. If it seems extremely pale, then think it might be holly blue. And if it seems a slightly purple blue, then think, well, that's probably common. However, with all these sorts of comparisons, it really would help if you had them flying side by side, and then you might be able to say, oh, look, that one's a bit more brilliant than this one. But when you see one in isolation, I think this is very difficult too. You get your eye in after a number of years, but to begin with, judging the quality of the blue when it flies past is quite difficult. Something that is helpful is that generally speaking, when you see them flying around, small blue and brown Argus look a sort of silvery blue and dark rather than the obvious brilliant blue that these three can be, the males of these three can be. So, as I just alluded, there is a difference between the males and the females. So generally speaking, if it looks silvery green when it flies past, it's probably a brown Argus. And if it looks silvery blue or even brown when it flies past, then it could be a female common blue or a female Adonis blue or either sex of small blue. So fly past blues are a problem. You get a clue from the size, you get a clue from the apparent shade of blue and perhaps the fact that it isn't blue and it's silvery or browny coloured. But luckily for us, the blues are far more obliging than the species we've talked about previously, and they usually stop. Now, that isn't always true of holly blue. They can fly a long way, but most of the blues are quite territorial. They adopt a patch and they stay there. So if you stand still and wait, it'll probably stop close by you. It might fly away and then come back to where you are, settle so you can look at it. I produced this fairly complicated key. I am not going to read it. I think if you want to study this by going through the video and paging back to it, then that's absolutely fine. But I think that it does no one any good if I read out something that's written down. It's just boring. So we'll point out that it's there. I think it is useful, but I'm not going to go through it.
Just had a question.
Yep. Go on, Dave. David, I can't hear you. Right. Well, assuming that everybody else can hear me, I'm going to carry on and hope that David comes back. He seems to have vanished. Oh,
Oh, I'm
right.
here.
I didn't hear
Sorry.
the question. Sorry.
Sorry. Are Chalk Hill blues and Adonis, female Chalk Hills and Adonis blues very similar?
Yes, immensely so. I will be showing you a slide that purports to tell you how to tell them apart. In reality, it's very difficult unless, a bit like the ringlet with the white edge if it's fresh. You can tell the two apart if they're fresh, but if they're worn, it's near impossible. Back to this. So I think this is my most useful thing about the blues. If you take nothing else away from all this, apart from looking at the wing edges, you must remember that, then the point about the blues, the very first thing to decide is, are there any signs anywhere on either the top or the undersurface of red lunules, anything red? Because these two species, holly blue on the left, small blue on the right, there's no red at all, not even a hint, not even a bit of pink, no red. So if you see a butterfly and you think that looks blue when it's flying, even if you think it looks silvery blue or browny blue, whatever color it looked, if it was bluish and it settles, if you can't see any red, you know it's holly blue or small blue, and then you can work out which of the two it is. If it's got any red somewhere, then it can't be either of these. And that helps because the blues can be a bit tricky, but singling out these two from the others, you either eliminate them or you then work on which of the two is it. And the holly blue, on its purely white background, has black streaks. They're not dots. They're not circular. Some of them look a bit circular. ish, but they're mostly streaks. And if you get to see it closely enough, the edges, which we love, have, on the forewing only, have black veins showing. Even though the black veins don't show on the rest of the wing, they do show in the wing margin and on the upper surface, look. The small blue has on the undersurface, which is actually a very pale grey, has black dots. They are circular by and large, and they're white ringed or haloed. No black veins on either wing. And the small blue, if it opens its wings for you, which would be helpful, you'll see, well, it's not actually blue either. It's sort of a relatively unmarked, uniform slate grey, navy blue colour. The males are slightly bluer than the females. They have some blue scales in there which can catch the light and make them look quite blue at certain angles, but they don't really look blue. Not the way that the holly blue does. And the holly blue, if it opens its wings, it doesn't matter if it's a male or a female. They're both brilliant blue. So you've seen a blue butterfly, you've identified when it flew past you, that's a blue of some sort. Then it settles, you immediately spot, oh, there's no red. Well, in that case, it must be holly blue or small blue. So if it's got its wings shut, look to see if it's streaked for holly blue or spotted for small blue S spotted. And if it opens its wings, holly blue, male and female, are bright blue. Small blue, male and female, are this sort of navy blue, slate grey colour. Now on to the rest of the blues. Oh, sorry, no, we're not. I thought it's worth pointing out that at the moment, flying around, there is this little day-flying moth called a chimney sweeper. Now, you might look at a chimney sweeper, having heard me talk about small blues, and if I hadn't mentioned chimney sweeper, think, well, that must be a small blue, because look at that, it's a sort of a slate grey colour, and when it flew past me, it looked paler, like a blue would possibly look. But if you notice, we love our wing edges, don't we? Look at these tips, bright white tips on the chimney sweeper. Nothing similar in the small blue. Okay, on to the slightly trickier species. I think you might notice that on the left we have a butterfly, which can be the same size as the small blue, but this one has got some obvious red, really obvious red. And this butterfly, as it says, is a brown argus. So although it's got a dark wing colour, male and female, there's no question it can't be a small blue because of all the red. And in addition, if you notice, it's got black veins going through the margin. They don't go all the way, right the way through, but they do come into the margin. So here's another brown argus on the right. And I'm highlighting that these black veins come into the margin. And here's a female common blue on the left. And people who've heard me before will know I like to alliterate. Common blues have clear borders, no black veins. Just there's some sort of damage which makes it look like there might be a single vein, but one vein or one little bit of damage isn't what we're looking for. This is a largely clear border, white, without any interruption of any sort apart from that bit of damage. Here there is obviously a deliberate, that's the wrong word, isn't it? Every single time you see a brown argus, if it's relatively fresh and it hasn't lost this edge, then you will see the veins in the margin. Additional differences between the female common blue, which can look very brown. This one looks sort of halfway between brown and blue, doesn't it? Some female common blues look very blue. Some female common blues look very brown, and some look like this one, which is a mix. But they always have sort of orangey coloured red lunules, if that isn't a silly thing to say, whereas the brown argus has obviously redder red lunules, and they go, in the male anyway, right up the wing. So you can see the difference between them, I think. Something that I was told once, which I've always found really helpful ever since. You might see a fairly smart common blue and think, oh, I wonder if that's a brown Argus. That's quite neat. And the lunules are quite starkly contrasted because they look quite reddish. If you think to yourself, this is a nice allegory or whatever the word is, if you think to yourself that is wearing a dress for the first time that it bought specially to go to a really important wedding or to go to investiture at the palace or something, that's a brown Argus. If you think, well, it looks really nice, but it looks like actually that dress has been worn before and it's thinking about wearing it to the office soon because it's worn it to a couple of weddings already, that's a common blue. So they look nice, very nice, but they never look quite as smart and well turned out as a brown Argus. The silver-studded blue female is browner than the common blue female, but in addition, look, we've got this black margin. The male and female silver-studded blues, and you don't get silver-studded blues in the Chilterns anymore, I'm afraid. We used to, but now you have to go to southeast Berkshire, just out of the Chilterns, into the region just south of Slough. So anyway, silver-studded blues, a broad black border. And if you notice, the marks, the lunules on the common blue are relatively pointy, aren't they? Whereas the silver-studded blue, they're more sinuous, they're more curvy. They don't have the same angular pointedness. It's a subtle difference, but it is a difference. Both of them, I'm afraid, have clear borders. So it is entirely possible, if you're remembering what I've told you about looking for a clear border, to think it must be a common blue. But the silver-studded blue, only found in Berkshire in our region, is unfortunately a butterfly where the clear border rule doesn't work, but the thick black inside the border should help you, because here, although it's relatively strong, especially in the hind wing, it's nothing like as thick, is it? And you can see the pale coloured edges to the lunules. Here, nothing like that, just black. Brown Argus and common blue underside look quite similar. The common blue is slightly browner, and the brown Argus, bizarrely, having given the name brown Argus, is slightly silverier. But the thing that really makes a difference, if the edges are so worn that you can't see this clear border and the veins on the brown Argus to separate them, if they've lost that edge for some reason, been battered around in the vegetation by the strong wind or something, then you can see that on the common blue, there's an extra dot just here, close to the body, inside the cell spot, whereas here, there's the cell spot. There's a complete lack of any other spot. So between the body and the cell spot, there's a space. And on the hind wing, here we've got a relatively smooth arc. And here on the brown Argus, you can see these two spots are not in the same smooth alignment. That spot should be up there somewhere. So those two together, making a sort of figure eight, or some people refer to it as a colon, is a good way of telling these species apart. Female common blue and female Adonis blue. Well, there's one way to tell a common blue from everything apart from silver-studded blue, we already said. Clear border. Adonis blue, black veins. Otherwise, they can look very similar, but black veins, really obvious. Perhaps we could argue they're not black, they're very dark brown. But anyway, veins going through the border. Checkered border. And Adonis blue male, the same, checkered borders look. And a common blue male with clear borders. Sometimes common blues are so beautifully coloured that you can be mistaken for thinking it's an Adonis. But you will remember that we live by looking for wing edges, and that you will immediately check, is that a clear border? And if it's a beautiful blue with clear borders, I'm afraid it's just a beautiful common blue. If it's even a slightly dingy blue, but with veins through, then it's probably Adonis, isn't it? On the underside, again, the thing that really helps you tell them apart is the black veins through the edge of the wing. You can sometimes see a bit of the inside of the wings to see the bright blue color, but otherwise the pattern is really very similar. So don't think there's something special you need to look for in the way the spots are placed on the wing, because there isn't really. It's the veins on the edges, wing edges again. Clear border, common blue. Silver-studded blue, male common blue. I've said all this, be very quick. White border, clear on both species. Thin black line inside on the common blue. Thicker black line inside that white margin on the silver-studded. Oh yes, here it gives the appearance, or can give the appearance, of there being little black triangles on the hind wing. Nothing like that look, but always it's darker in a thicker band. The underside's pretty simple to tell apart because you get these little bits here, which I wouldn't have said were silver. I'd have said they were bright blue. But inside the lunule, the red lunule, you get these blue speckles, and it can be on several of these eye spots. But anyway, they're bright blue, and of course we get nothing like that. You haven't even got the black circles, look. You've got these bits here which are in the white, but these are on the edge of the orangey red and the white. So it's quite different, really. Much more rounded silver-studded blue, more angular in the common blue. Okay, this is the bit where I always say to you, okay, have you been able to remember anything? I know I've told you an awful lot, and there's a lot to remember. So these are two species of blue. Both the pictures on the left are the male of the species, and the pictures on the right are the male of a different species. So what species are they? You will remember what we were saying earlier. We start by worrying about how much red there is, and then we go from there. So I'm thinking you've probably had enough time now to realize that the one on the left doesn't have any red, and you'll have remembered that means it's either small blue or holly. And on the right, you'll see there are some red, so you'll know that means it could be one of several species, but you'll have spotted the clear borders. So maybe when you see the clear borders, you look at it and think, well, hang on a minute, are those veins coming into the margin? Ooh, that could be Adonis, couldn't it? But no, overall, the borders are much clearer than they would be if it was an Adonis blue. These veins would be much more prominent coming into the margin. So what do we think these are? Holly blue, well done. And common blue, yes, well done. Shall we pause and take some questions on the blues? We've got skippers and hairstreaks to do, and the day flying moths.
Don't think we've got any more questions since the Chalk Hill Adonis Blue question.
Well, I didn't actually put the chalk hill into this, but I'm going to go back and show you the answer as soon as I've been asked it. Yeah, there's the Adonis female. So if you find an Adonis female, I hope people can see, inside the red lunule area, right next to the margin with the obvious veins, you've got these blue scales. If this was a female chalk-hill blue, they would be white, so that the same color as the margin. Now, this works perfectly if you've got a really fresh female Adonis blue. But if your female Adonis blue has been flying around for a week, she may well have lost many of these blue scales. And it starts to be a matter of looking at it and saying, I'm really sorry, but I just cannot tell. So if it's fresh, these blue scales on the hind wing allow you to say that's Adonis and not female chalky. It's got to be Adonis or chalky because it's got the black veins going through the wing. If it was an Adonis blue, it wouldn't have these blue scales here either. So it's, did I say if it's an Adonis? But I meant if it's a brown Argus, it would have black veins through the margin, and it would have more obvious red lunules here, but it wouldn't have any blue there. So this, the only thing this can be is Adonis blue female, but sadly, Chalkhill blue females look really similar, and Adonis blue females do wear so that they lose these blue scales. So I'm afraid you can't always tell.
Another question, Nick. Are the
Yep.
spots on the upper forewing of a brown Argus diagnostic?
Uh, Now I think we're referring here to these black cell spots. If you've got the light behind a female common blue, oh, I'm looking at that. Yes, that's all right. That is the right, not the brown Argus, is it? Let's go to a brown Argus picture. There we go. So there's a black cell spot. Usually, if you're looking at a butterfly that's being lit from above, if you can see that black cell spot, then that is quite a good way of saying, yeah, that's a brown Argus, because it's really obvious there, and it isn't on the common blue here, is it? But as I just showed you, accidentally, you can sometimes, with the light being sort of behind the wing, you get a hint of the cell spot showing through. So I wouldn't say it's 100%, but I would say it's 75% of the time. If you can see a cell spot really clearly, then it's a brown Argus and not a common blue. But it can sometimes show through if the light is from behind the butterfly, even if it isn't a brown Argus. So I'm hedging my bet slightly there and saying 75% of the time. Usually it's a good way to tell if you've got the butterfly lit from above.
Thanks, Nick.
Right. Everyone get ready. Skippers. And this actually is going to be quite simple because I think these are easy and I always find it odd that people struggle so with them. The large skipper, the wing margin, look, there's an obvious contrast between the orange near the body and the wing edge. The small and the Essex skipper, it's pretty much the same colour orange all across the wing. On the underside, the large skipper has these pale spots in a sort of greenish field, orange still, but greener. And the small and the Essex skipper don't. It's just uniform, really. So there's variation in the ground colour of the upper and lower surface of the large skipper. And it's all the same in the small and the Essex. They're just the colour they are without much variation. So you should be able to tell these species apart quite easily and separate the large skipper from the small and the Essex. Another thing that is helpful is that the large skipper has black tips to its antenna, which we notice are on the others as well, but these have got a pointy tip to them. So, oh, hang on, we'll come to the pointy tip in a moment. The small skipper and the Essex skipper can be a real pain to tell apart. However, the small skipper has a relatively long and slightly bent scent mark, as it's called on the male, and the Essex skipper has such a small and insignificant scent mark that it's actually quite difficult to see it. So you might never have noticed it was there before until I pointed out, and that wouldn't be surprising because it is difficult to see. So the scent marks on the upper surface of the small and the Essex skipper are very helpful if you've got a male. Unfortunately, the females of both species are completely without a scent bar. And then you're restricted to looking for a couple of features. This is a small skipper, which has orangey colour tips to the antenna. They can be brown, but they are never black. And the Essex skipper always has the stem of the antenna pretty much the same colour orange as the wings, and then a distinct change, a really disjunctive change from the orange straight through to black. So when you do find a small skipper with a relatively brown tip to its antenna, it's a gradual change from paler. You can see it here to an extent. Starts off pale and gets darker, but in this one it only goes as far as orange. Occasionally they do go to quite dark brown, but there's a gradual change. Here there's a really obvious contrast. But if we look at these tips, we can see that they're blunt-ended, rounded. And if we look at the large skipper, we can see that even though it can have black tips, this one isn't particularly black, but they can be quite black. This large skipper has pointy tips. And for those who like a quiz, is this a male or a female? And the answer is, it's got the scent bar, like we saw in the small and the Essex skipper a moment ago. So it's a male. Okay, any questions on the skippers? I haven't dealt with grizzled and dingy because I think they've finished. I haven't dealt with silver spotted because I don't think it's starting yet.
One one question about the Essex can the Essex be told from the small because it has floofier facial hair?
Oh, I'd never thought of that. Flutier.
Fluffier, I think.
Fluffier, perhaps. Okay, even so. Well, my picture here doesn't show that, does it? Maybe the hairs are a bit longer. I have never considered that. I will, this summer, be looking very carefully at my Essex skippers to see if they're fluffier. One thing you can definitely do on a really fresh Essex skipper is see that the colour, the ground colour of the forewing, have I got? No, it doesn't show it very well there. But the ground colour of the forewing of the Essex skipper goes pretty much the same all the way from the body right to the tip. A small skipper, it starts off this lovely orange colour and it goes nearly all the way to the tip, but then the tip tends to be grey or green. Now this isn't, it's a bit like something else where I said about 75% of the time. So I always look at the antenna if I get a chance to tell which of these two it is. But if it settles briefly and I see the tip and then it flies off and I never see it again, I would be prepared to be quite confident if it was a really contrasted tip compared with the rest of the wing, compared with the Essex skipper, the small skipper with the contrast. And the Essex skipper is much more uniform right the way across the whole wing. If you want to check that, have a look at some ID guides where they've got photos in the ID guide, and you'll see that that is the case. Okay, day flying moths, unless there's some more questions on skippers.
No, no more questions.
Okay, I know that some people think, oh, day flying moths, come on. Move on, move on. So I will go quickly. So we've got some brown and grey ones, and many of you will have seen the Burnet companion already this spring, but they keep flying for a while yet. The mint moth, as it's called, this little fella, is just starting a second brood, so they're going to be around in good numbers. Very similar, but subtly different. I mean, this picture, these two pictures, they look very different, don't they? But when the common purple and gold gets a little bit older and worn, it starts to look much more like this in terms of its coloration, but that's a beautiful little moth. So both these are about, and the silver Y moth is increasing in number because it's a migrant from abroad, and they're coming in at the minute with all this warm weather. And that mark on the wing is the bit that's the Y. So these are all, by the way, even though it says at the top, and you probably know it, they're all day flying. You will see them flying about deliberately. It's not just that you've scared them out of the grass. Hummingbird hawk moth, I've seen my first ones this week, which is lovely. Small yellow underwing coming right to the end of its brood now. You might not see any of these because it's been so hot. I think they may have finished their spring brood, but just possibly. I put it in there because it looks superficially like the mint moth, but there are no orange blobs on the forewing. And the mother Shipton with its witch's face is definitely still around, and you should see them for a good month or so yet. So if you don't know it, follow this line here, which is the top of the head, going to a very large nose, coming back to the eye, and then down to an open mouth above a very large chin. And there's the witch's face. Because Mother Shipton was a famous witch. Well, so famous that perhaps some of you have never heard of her, but she was a witch, and she was relatively famous. Day-flying moths that look white. So these are the things which, by and large, you do see when you startle them out of the grass. They don't, perhaps these treble bars slightly different, but anyway, they don't fly of their own volition very often, but they're usually sitting in a position in the grass where they're very easily scared up. I think they're very pretty, but quite similar looking, so you'll need to be careful. It's always best, I think, to take pictures of these species so that you can get them checked to make sure. And a plume is one of many that adopt this strange position. They furl their wings rather like furled sails when they settle. Very strange to us because all the other moths don't do that, but they do it, and then they look a bit like a letter T. There are some obviously red things, and these can be quite confusing because they look very similar in flight. So the cinnabar has got a stripe and an all red hind wing. The 5-spot burnet, narrow bordered, and 6-spot burnet have got red hind wings, but you don't often see them. So the way to tell them apart is the stripe on the cinnabar. Look at the wing tip. Don't we like our edges? Look at the wing tip of the narrow bordered and the 5-spot burnet, and there is one red spot in this tip. Look at the 6-spot, and there are 2 spots because it's got one extra. These beautiful, beautiful day-flying moths both have spots on the red hind wings, which are often visible when they land. So that means they can't be cinnabar or burnets, but you wouldn't think they were burnets because of the white stripes on the Jersey tiger and the spots, which can be cream actually, on the scarlet tiger. They're both all of these moths are flying around at the minute. If you were in Berkshire looking maybe for those silver-studded blues and you see a 5-spot burnet, you might actually be seeing a proper 5-spot burnet and not the narrow-bordered. In the Chilterns, we've only got narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet, but in Berkshire, they've got the 5-spot burnet and the narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet, and they are pretty much impossible to tell apart without taking them to pieces and looking at them under a microscope. So most of us won't be doing that. Yellowy coloured moths, you've got the yellow shell, which I think is really lovely. Again, it doesn't often fly about of its own volition, but it's very easily startled out of the grass. The common heath, which does fly about of its own volition. And the shaded broadbar, which, a bit like the yellow shell, is more likely to be scared up by you walking, but you will see it with this stripe across the centre. And then the green ones, the emerald, small emerald, green carpet, and if you're lucky, a forester, a day-flying moth that does make its sort of main time of living and doing everything the day, whereas these two are really nighttime moths that also move about by day. But this one is a diurnal species and quite rare, which is odd because the caterpillars live on sorrel, and you'd think, well, there's plenty of sorrel about, but as so often with these rare things, they need it growing under special conditions. Right, I've got a couple more extra special ones to go, and then we're finished. But are there any questions on day-flying moths?
Not so far, Nick. No.
I sort of suspected they'd attract less questions. And I have, of course, only dealt with a small number of our day-flying moths, and I didn't deal with any of the micro
I've got a
moths at all.
question.
Go on then.
I get some of those in my moth trap at night.
Yep.
It is under the carpets. Uh, when you say they're day-flying moths, do you mean that these are moths that you can scare up from the grass in the day, or that they are actively doing stuff because they're obviously doing stuff at night as well. Small emeralds I get. Yeah,
Well, I did say the yellow shell and the shaded broadbar, you're more likely to see them if you scare them up, but they will fly about of their own volition. The common heath is definitely a daytime species, as is the forester. The green carpet, it does move about and it could find a mate during the day. I think quite a lot of moths are prepared to fly by day if they get startled or if something disturbs the vegetation they're sitting in, but they don't really want to fly around in the day because they know they're a bit vulnerable to bird attack. So most of the moths that we see flying in the day are capable of flying in the day and flying at night. But there are some which really do make a deliberate policy of deliberately flying about and doing all their business during the day.
right.
So of these, the ones we just saw, oops, here, these red ones,
Yeah,
these are all definitely
with the warning
determined to
spots.
fly about in the
Yeah,
day.
that makes sense.
And they're using this warning color system to tell the birds that might eat them, leave me alone, you won't like it. But these are better camouflage because they're a bit more likely to get picked on, I think. Okay, some of our lovely speciality species. So we've got a white letter hair streak here. Now, it'd be really good if you can find some white letter hair streaks in the Chilterns. I'm really struggling. I haven't seen a white letter hair streak for 2 years now. Um, they are in the Chilterns. People do see them, just not me. So don't come for a walk with me if you want to see a white letter hair streak. You need to find fairly long-lived elm trees, and that's the issue, isn't it? Elm trees don't live all that long. They get Dutch elm disease and die. But if you see a white letter hair streak, you're looking for this black line here inside the red lunual. That proves it's a black hair. A black line proves it's a white letter hair streak. I hope I've got that. I'll say that again because I didn't say it very clearly. If you can see a black line inside the red on a hair streak butterfly, it is a white letter. If, on the other hand, you went to North Bucks, north of Aylesbury, or North Oxfordshire, you might see a black hair streak, and that has black dots. So the black hair streak has black dots. Now, unfortunately, those living in the north of Bucks and some bits of North Oxfordshire, you can find these two flying around together. And they are really tricky to tell apart because they tend to be high above you. So you're always looking up through the bushes at them and against the light, which makes it really hard to see this sort of detail. But they do occasionally come down. White letter hair streaks particularly like to feed on flowers like thistles and sometimes bramble. And the black hair streak is fond of bramble and also privet. So that might help you find them. Look for the flowers, but then stand and stare at the elm tree or the blackthorn if all else fails. But the black hair streak will definitely be coming to an end in the next week. This very hot weather has made them speed through their brood. It's been pretty good. White letter hair streaks are still a bit thin on the ground because there aren't that many elm trees about. They are in a At the minute, most of the elm trees in the area where I look anyway seem to be dying with the disease. It'll be a few years before they recover again. Now, something that David and I were talking about before we started was that some people swear that it's best to look for these species either very early morning or quite late in the evening. They definitely are species a bit like the browns, which are affected by heat in the middle of the day. They don't like to fly about when it's very hot. So if, for instance, you were looking for them tomorrow, I would say don't bother between 11:30 and 3 o'clock because they will still be there and they'll still move around occasionally, but they'll be much more visible before 11:30 and after 3 o'clock. This white W here, which some people say is a really good way to tell it from the black hair streak, it can get worn, so it can end up looking a bit more like this. Like so many of these features on butterflies, they wear with time. But the black line compared with the black blobs is pretty always. I've never yet seen a butterfly where you couldn't see some hint of that. Now, purple hairstreak is actually one you're supposed to survey in the evening because it's so much more active then than it is in the middle of the day. If you're lucky, I had to borrow this picture because I haven't got one like this. If you're lucky, you'll see these fantastic males. The females are pretty good too, but look at the color on that. The underside is this sort of silvery, and they're always found near oak trees. No, that's silly, isn't it? They're nearly always found near oak trees. You might find them away from an oak tree where they've bred if they've got blown away by the wind to a distance, but they can hang around a single oak tree in the landscape their entire life. The egg is laid there, the caterpillar feeds there, the pupa will be in the ground at the base of the tree. The adult comes out, dries its wings. If you're lucky, you'll catch it near the ground to get a fantastic picture. Then it flies back to the top of the tree where it mates. The females lay their eggs and the cycle goes round again. So you can find purple hair streaks on a single big oak tree in an area where there are no other oak trees at all. There'll be a colony there that just persists right through time. Be aware when you're looking at the top of oak trees and seeing this silver outline of a purple hair streak that holly blues can be up there too, feeding on the aphid dew, which the purple hair streak feed on at the top of oak trees. So just make sure if you can through binoculars or a telescope that you're looking at something with a white streak across it and these red eyes, if you can see them, these red eye spots, not a white surface with black spots. And then I think we get right to the end now. I put these in. I know that the white admirals are flying in our district. Both the purple emperor and white admiral are seen in the Chilterns and right across the upper Thames branch, but in low numbers in most places. Purple emperor is another butterfly that people are sure it's easiest to find if you go early in the morning. Many people say the best thing is to go on a day when it's showery because if you get a shower and then the sun comes back out, the purple emperors are much more active after the shower than they would have been previously. It never actually seems to shower anymore in the Chilterns, so that's out for us. So early morning, and dog walkers can be your friend in this regard because if they don't bother to clear up after their dog, the purple emperors will come down to feed on the dog poo. They like the various salts they can get from a fresh dog turd because it's still moist. The purple emperor, the male, has this purple sheen and it has it on both wings, but only if the angle is right, which is why it only shows on one wing here because this wing was at slightly the wrong angle to the light. And the female has both wings looking like this. They are big, they are powerful, they fly around the tops of trees very strongly. The males launch out and attack other things that go past. The white admiral tends to fly at lower levels and it glides a bit like a sparrowhawk, flap, flap, glide, flap, flap, glide. This purple emperor tends to have a powerful flight that is maintained with lots and lots of strokes, as it were, slow, steady beats. White admiral a bit more rapid beat, glides, and the white admiral does handbrake turns and comes back the way it just went. Purple emperor tends not to do that. The undersides are very similar, but the purple emperor has eyes on both hind and forewing. Emperor eyes. And the white admiral has got rows of dots, look. If it's against the light and difficult to see, then the fact that the white admiral has so much more white near the body can sometimes be obvious. Sometimes it is obvious that the butterfly you're looking at, despite being a silhouette, is much paler near the body, as the white admiral is. Okay, just to mention that really, really good if you can record all the butterflies you see. I was asked a question yesterday, does that mean every time you see a meadow brown in the same place you saw one several days recently, you should record it. Well, maybe not. I think the answer is we are supposed to record everything we see, but I think recording every single meadow brown every time you see one is perhaps a bit over the top. If you see it in a place where you've not seen it, record it. If you go to places you've not been to, record everything. But I don't think you need to record literally everything you see in your garden every day if you're seeing the same thing day after day. Record the changes. Um, this app, free for your phone, is really good. It does day flying moths as well, the macro ones. And there are, of course, other ways to record if you prefer using your computer rather than your phone. You can come home and stick it onto this butterfly recording, Butterflies for New Millennium, if only I could speak. And iRecord can also give you an app for your phone or on your computer to record everything else you see while you're out looking for butterflies and moths. And in order to get on with all this various stuff, recording and so on, I've recorded quite a few videos in the online talks at the Upper Thames branch to help you with any difficulties you might have over that. Ignore that. That's because I'd forgotten that this slide was used last year. Okay, I hope that's been useful. If there's any more questions, I'm very happy to take them, but I suspect I've gone on for at least an hour and a half.
You have indeed, but I think everyone's stuck with you. Just one from Sarah. So if it's 27 or 28 degrees or over, is it better to survey for butterflies before 11:30 or after 3 p.m.? Would you recommend that or
No, you can't. I
okay?
think I might be wrong about this. I'd need to check. I should have checked it before I started to speak. But I think with the wider countryside butterfly survey, you can start at 10:30. With transects, it's 10:45. So you can
Okay.
start a bit earlier and you can start a bit later with your transects and wider countryside butterfly survey, but you can't go way
Yeah.
outside
Okay.
those limits. You know, you can bend the rules by 15 minutes, half an hour, but you can't go an hour or more.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks,
Any,
Nick. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with it and
yeah,
joining
well
us. It's
done.
great. This is
Tremendous
going to
stamina.
be. I'm going to stop recording now.